Okay, so some of you may know of a YouTuber called Rem. He's a friend of Destiny. A while ago, he got annihilated by JHC on Destiny's stream. It's a pretty hilarious stream. I'll link it down below. Basically, this guy has his knickers in a knot over the topic of realism, moral realism specifically. So the whole time he's poking at JHC in this stream, trying to get JHC to engage him on the topic. Then finally at the end, JHC just decides to do it and annihilates him. So it's really funny. I'll link that down below. You guys will all laugh at it. Okay, so Rem has made a video where he attempts to destroy my entire worldview. He uses words something like that. So he provides two formal arguments. They're both deductively invalid, but the first one is close enough to being valid that we can correct it and reach a valid form, so I can respond to that one. And then the second one is so far from being valid that I don't know what he thinks he's trying to say. So this video is just going to be me responding to those two arguments that he provides. But I'd also just like to make one side comment about his usage of language. So let's just go over to his video and just listen to how Rem defines moral anti-realism.
Moral anti-realism is simply, and this is very simple, so I don't know why you're having such a tough time grasping it, that moral statements do not have a truth value.
Okay, so it's not that I have a tough time grasping what those words mean, right? The thing that I'm struggling with is that what you are talking about is called non-cognitivism, not anti-realism, right? So non-cognitivism is a subset of anti-realism. It's not the whole thing. So a non-cognitivist theory of ethics implies that ethical sentences are neither true nor false. That is, they lack truth value, okay? So this would be like saying all cars are Mercedes. It's obviously not the case. Mercedes are a subset of cars. Now, if you just want to say you're using private language or something and that, you have just a proprietary definition of anti-realism that is just equivalent to non-cognitivism, then okay, but that's not what the term is typically taken to mean. So I just wanted to point that out. Now, let's go over to his arguments and sort of analyze what he has to say here. So here's the first argument. Now, the propositions are P, according to the anti-realist, about morality, which it's not really a proposition. We'll get to that in a second. Q, there are no categorical normative reasons, and then R, there are no epistemic reasons for belief. So one of the first problems is that this whole first premise reads as just a proposition, right? So according to the anti-realist about morality, there are no categorical normative reasons. Now, I'm able to infer that what he's actually trying to do is an implication here, where, I want to click better, where this is the antecedent and this is the consequent. Now, the problem is that this isn't a proposition, right? According to the anti-realist about morality, that's not something that can be true or false, right? So what you would want to do is actually change that into a proposition, something like moral anti-realism is true. So like if moral anti-realism is true, then there are no categorical normative reasons. Because right now, as this reads, you would just represent that in prop logic, at least, with just one variable, because that is just one proposition. But again, since he uses these words down here again, right, he uses the same phrasing, there are no categorical normative reasons, I can tell what he's trying to do here is a hypothetical syllogism. So I know that this is supposed to be an implication here. So we'll take it to be a P implies Q, even though he's written it kind of weirdly. Okay, so then there's two other problems with respect to validity, right? So then later in one of his conclusions here, I guess that should have a comma, but whatever. In one of his conclusions, so there are categorical reasons. Well, this is not one of these propositions, right? So if we were actually going to be clear about this in the formal sense, that would have to be a separate proposition. If we represent that with a separate proposition like S, this is just going to come out invalid, right? But I'm not an asshole. I know what you're trying to do. So obviously, by categorical reasons, I'm assuming you must mean categorical normative reasons, right? So I'm assuming what you've done here is you've set up a hypothetical syllogism, P implies Q, Q implies R, and then you're saying not R, and then you're getting to not Q via modus tollens, and then when you have that not Q, you're able to get to not P via modus tollens. I assume that that's what you're actually trying to do here. Now, the problem is right here, this not Q, there are no categorical reasons. That's not the same as any of these propositions, right? So I'm assuming that what this is supposed to say, which I've corrected it to, is there are no categorical normative reasons. And then down here, the moral anti-realist theory is false. This is also not one of these three propositions, right? Now, if we represent it with its own proposition, if we just call that T or something, it's just going to come out invalid. So, I mean, it relates really closely to this first part of what is supposed to be an implication here, according to the anti-realist about morality. Like, I'm assuming that that could be made equivalent to if anti-realism is true, and then this could be like if anti-realism is false, right? So if we correct for all of these errors, we're going to get a form something like this, okay? So if moral anti-realism is true, then there are no categorical normative reasons. If there are no categorical normative reasons, then there are no categorical epistemic reasons for belief. But there are categorical epistemic reasons for belief, so there are categorical normative reasons, so moral anti-realism is false. That would be a proper deduction there. Now, the only other change I've made here is I've added the word categorical before epistemic. Oh, that looks a little weird here. I'll just correct that so it doesn't trip anyone out. I've underlined the parts that have been changed. So the reason for that is, well, I guess I'll go through the premises and I'll show why I've put that there. Okay, so let's look at the very first premise. Okay, if moral anti-realism is true, then there are no categorical normative reasons. Okay, well, we'd have to know exactly what we mean by moral anti-realism. But, you know, I'm happy to grant that, because what he means when he says anti-realism is that basically non-cognitivism, right? So if non-cognitivism is true, there's no categorical normative reasons. I would grant that, sure. Okay, so the second premise, if there are no categorical normative reasons, then there are no categorical epistemic reasons for belief. Now, this is something that you could push back on, right? You could say that these are two different types of reasons. So like a non-cognitivist might respond by just saying, well, look, when we're talking in the domain of morality, those are just expressions of non-cognitive mental states. They aren't really like, you know, they're not really like propositions or anything like this. So there's just this disanalogy between the two, and saying that there aren't like, you know, there's not any kind of normative reason that could be like represented as a proposition with truth value, right? There's saying that there's not that in the context of morality doesn't mean that there's not that in the context of facts, right? So someone could be an anti-realist, by Rem's words, just about morality and not about epistemic reasons for belief. And they could do that by creating a disanalogy and saying that the reason that exists for saying that there's not categorical normative reasons is not going to apply to categorical epistemic reasons. And the reason you'd give is that the categorical normative reasons, these are really just expressions of non-cognitive mental states. These aren't. So if we say non-cognitive mental states can't be represented as propositions, then we're gonna lose these, or they can't have truth value. We're gonna lose these, but we're not going to lose these, right? So that's one way you could break the analogy if you're a non-cognitivist. But I'm frankly just happy to grant it, right? I think that you'd want to rephrase it a bit. You'd probably want to say something like, if your reason for rejecting categorical normative reasons applies to categorical epistemic reasons, then you'd have, if there are no categorical normative reasons, there are no categorical epistemic reasons. Now, the reason I've added categorical here is because this is like just trivially easy to reject if you don't have the word categorical there, right? If we go off of Rem's phrasing, if there's no categorical normative reasons, then there are no epistemic reasons. Well, there could be epistemic reasons that aren't categorical, right? They could just be like hypothetical norms. So I'm assuming you must be talking about categorical epistemic reasons. And also, what does he mean by categorical? Well, let's go over to his video for that. So here So here we see Rem's definition of categorical. The end towards which we ought to drive. Basic norm. Okay, so the end towards which we ought to drive. So my question is that a hypothetical norm or is that something else? Now, a hypothetical norm is something that we ought do given a goal, right? So if my goal is to drink water, then I ought get a glass. It's just saying that getting the glass would be part of the pathway to drinking water. It facilitates the achievement of my goal. I'm fine with norms like that. But I take it that if you're talking about a categorical norm, at minimum, it's not just a hypothetical norm, right? If all you're talking about here reduces down to hypothetical norms, then we're not going to have any meaningful disagreement, and you're going to agree that the reasons to believe in things like logic or morality, they're just hyponorms, right? Like we have a desire to be logical, so we should be logical. Now, I think Rem is not going to want to accept that. I think he's going to want to say that a categorical norm is not just a hypothetical norm. So when he says the end towards which we ought to drive, I mean, don't just cash it out as a hypothetical norm. Apparently there's some reason we ought to do this that doesn't just derive from us, having a desire to do it. So just keep that in mind. That's his definition, the end towards which we ought drive. It's not totally clear why we ought drive towards that end, but I'm assuming at minimum that it doesn't cash out as a hypothetical norm. So that's what he means by categorical. Okay, so returning to the corrected argument. Okay, so we'll grant the first premise under his definition of anti-realism. Then the second premise, we'll grant it. Like, it would need some modification. You'd want to use the word categorical, or else it's trivially easy to reject. Maybe there's like hyponorms that are epistemic reasons for belief, and right, it doesn't follow that those won't exist from there not being categorical moral norms. So we'll rephrase to categorical to make it stronger, and we'll also kind of interpret this as saying, like, if your reason for rejecting categorical normative reasons applies to categorical epistemic reasons, right? Because then you can't reject it in the way that a non-cognitivist might, by just saying, like, look, there are different types of norms, and the reason for rejecting the one doesn't apply to the other. So we'll grant here also that the reason for rejecting categorical epistemic norms or moral norms applies to categorical epistemic norms. And I think in my case it does. I'd also be clear, I don't make positive statements like there are no categorical normative reasons or there are no categorical epistemic reasons. I just lack a belief in these things, right? So in the same way as I don't hold the positive position that there is no God, I just lack the belief that there is a God. I don't hold a positive position that there are no categorical normative reasons. I just don't hold a position that such thing exists, right? There's a difference between holding the position that something doesn't exist and just not holding the position that it does exist. So that's also worth taking into account here. He keeps framing me as an anti-realist when really I would call myself more of a non-realist, because I think anti-realism requires a kind of positive claim, or at least it sort of seems like maybe it does. So I don't like that. I'd rather call myself a non-realist and then ask a realist to actually make their case that these things exist. Okay, so we're granting the first, we're granting the second. Now let's get to the third, right? But there are categorical epistemic reasons for belief. Well, I'm not convinced of that, right? That's not something that I currently believe. I'd need to be shown that those kind of reasons exist. So if we're talking about how one should be logical or should respect the law of non-contradiction or should view causation as uniform or something like this, whatever the kind of epistemic norm is you want to talk about, like, I think the should there is just a hyponorm. Like, if you have some goal and that goal is achieved by using logic or believing the law of non-contradiction, then you have a reason to believe the law of non-contradiction, but it just cashes out as a hypothetical norm, right? So I don't think it's some kind of categorical norm. At least I don't have reason to believe that. So I would firmly say I'm not on board with the third premise. So that's a problem right there. So there are categorical normative reasons. Now I grant that would follow modus tollens if you allow not R here, but I'm not allowing not R. So moral anti-realism is false. Again, I would call myself a non-realist, not an anti-realist. But this you also require this assertion here, this not R, to get here. via modus tollens from not Q to not P, right? So that would be my general take. If you give a really like kind of steel-manned interpretation, you could grant these first two, but the third one I would need some evidence for, and that stops me from reaching the conclusion here. Okay, now here's Rem's second argument, and this one is so far from valid that I really don't know how to react to it. So we'll read through it. If the epistemic anti-realist is true, it's kind of weird to say that the epistemic anti-realist, like a person, can be true, but whatever. If the epistemic anti-realist is true, then there are no epistemic reasons for belief. If there are no epistemic reasons for belief, then there is no epistemic reason to believe the anti-realist, the epistemic anti-realist. So either the epistemic anti-realist is false, or there is no epistemic reason to believe the epistemic anti-realist, so we should reject the epistemic anti-realist theory. So the epistemic existence premise is false. Okay, so let's get into this. Okay, now right off the bat, if the epistemic anti-realist is true, there are no epistemic reasons for belief. Well, again, like, it depends what you think you're saying there, right? So it could be that epistemic anti-realism is true, but there are reasons. They're just hyponorms, right? So I assume that what you actually mean there is categorical epistemic reasons for belief. Now, I think that would be a fair enough thing to say. If epistemic anti-realism is true, then there's no categorical epistemic reasons for belief. That seems fair enough. But I'd have two things, which is I don't really call myself an anti-realist. I'm a non-realist. But yeah, let's just grant that, right? Okay, and then if there's no categorical epistemic reasons for belief, we'll say categorical because again, it's just trivially easy to reject if he doesn't use the word categorical. If there are no categorical epistemic reasons for belief, then there is no epistemic reason to believe the epistemic anti-realist. Well, I mean categorical reason, presumably. Okay, so either the epistemic anti-realist is false, or there is no epistemic reason to believe the epistemic anti-realist. Now, this much is fine, right? So up to this point, we're looking at a valid argument. So it's just P implies Q, Q implies R, then you get to not P or R. So basically, what you would do here, this is just like a hypothetical syllogism. You could just condense that down to P implies R. And then if you have P implies R via material implication, you can say it's not P or R. So this is a fine conclusion here. So let's see, either the epistemic anti-realist is false, or there is no epistemic reason to believe the epistemic anti-realist. Well, I assume you're talking about a categorical reason again, otherwise it's trivially easy to reject a premise like this. So yeah, I would go with R, right? Like, I'm not currently of the belief that there are categorical epistemic reasons to believe the epistemic anti-realist. Now here's where it just gets weird. He says, so we should reject the epistemic anti-realist theory. Well, this is just a new proposition. Like, I don't know what you think you mean when you're saying that. The closest thing in your argument to that is the epistemic anti-realist is true, right? So, like, maybe you'd let us adjust this to so the epistemic anti-realist is false, but that would at least allow us to use one of the same propositional variables we used before instead of just adding a fresh variable like S, which is what your current form necessitates and which will obviously come out invalid. I'm assuming I don't need to draw up a truth table to explain that to someone who's taken philosophy. So, you know, we could represent it with not P, right? It's not the case that the epistemic anti-realist is true, but if we do that, then it's not clear how you're getting to not P, right? So if it's not P or R, you can't just say not P. Like, you have to have some deduction to get there, right? So you could do disjunctive syllogism. You could add in not R, right? You could say it's not the case that there's no epistemic reason to believe the epistemic anti-realist. If you were to say that, then you could reach this proposition here being false. I mean, maybe we should just attempt to rewrite here, see if we can make this argument a bit better. Here, so let's see. Let's change this so that we keep the wording consistent. Now, I don't know if this is even what he is trying to say. It's not the case that the epistemic anti-realist is true. So then we could change this to not P. That would work. But then you're gonna have a little problem. So um, let's like you can't get. I'm not gonna draw out all the truth tables right now, but none of these premises here will lead you to not P. Right? You'd need, if that is in fact what you want to do. If what you're actually trying to say here um, is you're not trying to introduce a completely new proposition, an S, which would just render the argument invalid. You're just trying to say this first proposition you add P is false, right? Then you can do that, but then you're going to have a problem. It's still going to be invalid unless you add some other premise in there, right? Like you can't just say not P or R and then just assert not P. You'd have to say, well, not R. If it's not R and it's a disjunct, then it's going to be not P, right? You could do that, but you'd need another premise in there to make this valid, right? There is no way to get from any combination of these first three premises to not P. You would have to have another premise in there. So even with the rewrite, it's still not quite valid. I guess you could do something like this. So here, let's just add in another premise. Let's take the latter half of the disjunct and let's just add in, it's not the case that there's no epistemic reason to believe the epistemic anti-realist. So then you could add in here, let's go not R, and then you can get to not P, right? So that's fine. Then you've just got a disjunctive syllogism there. Not P or R, it's not R, so then it's not P, right? That would work fine, but I don't know if he'd want to add a premise like this, but you could do that at least. That would fix it. But then I'd take issue with that premise, right? Because again, like you must be talking about categorical reasons here, and I'm still not convinced that there are categorical reasons to believe anything, right? I'm not convinced categorical reasons actually exist. Okay, so let's go back up here. That's just one potential fix, so we won't work off that in case you wouldn't want to do that. So then, we'll go to iteration 2 here, where it's a bit better. And then T, so the epistemic existence premise is true. Now, I have no idea what he thinks he's saying there. Like, I don't know how that relates to any of these propositions. I mean, maybe you could add another implication in there somewhere, like if not the epistemic anti-realist is true, then the epistemic existence premise is true. So you could add in another premise and fix that. So here, let's do that. I mean, it's ridiculous to have to do this much fixing on an argument, though. This makes me think Rem probably is not very competent with logic. One thing about a lot of philosophy programs. So I decided recently I'm going back to school, actually, which is going to be really fun. I'm going into a math program with a pretty heavy philosophy component. So there's lots of different types of classes in logic, right? There's classes on non-classical systems. There's classes on modal logic and stuff. A lot of philosophy programs just have one formal logic class in the whole bachelor's program. So they just learn basic, prop logic, a bit of first order, and maybe they'll do categorical syllogisms or something. And a lot of people don't do super well in that component also. So there's a lot of people walking around with philosophy degrees who aren't actually that good with logic, and it's possible that's what we're dealing with Rem, but it's just speculation. So we can try to fix this up a bit more. We could add in another premise, we can say that if it's not the case that the epistemic anti-realist is true, then the epistemic existence premise, whatever exactly that is true, right? And then we'd have to correct the form a little bit. Let's see. So we go not P implies. I guess we'll use a new variable. We'll call it S, and we'll call that S. And now at least the form will work, right? Now at least you can reach your conclusion. But you had to add in extra premises to actually make that work, right? So you had to add in a premise of not R to actually reach this conclusion of not P. And we had to reformulate the sentence to even make it clear it's not P, but whatever. And then to reach your final conclusion about the epistemic existence premise being true, we had to add another premise in the argument that if it's the case that not P, then S. And then we, put the S in there. So with a lot of tweaking, the argument can be rendered valid, but that one was a pretty horrendous job. No offense. Okay, so and basically my problems here, if we go off of the corrected version, let's go through that. So if the epistemic anti-realist is true, then there are no epistemic reasons. Again, we'll assume he's talking about categorical reasons, or else it's trivially easy to reject, and let's just grant that. If there are no categorical epistemic reasons for belief, then there are no categorical epistemic reasons to believe the anti-realist. Let's just grant that. So either the epistemic anti-realist is false, or there's no categorical epistemic reasons to believe the epistemic anti-realist. So I would lean more in that direction, right? Like, I'm not convinced that there are categorical epistemic reasons, so it's probably that half of the disjunct. Now, we got these two other premises that we've added to make his argument valid. If it's not the case that there's no epistemic reason to believe the epistemic, if it's not the case, this is just a proposition, this isn't an implication. It's not the case that there is no reason to believe the epistemic anti-realist, so that's an assertion that there are basically these categorical epistemic norms. So that's a premise that I would just take issue with, right? I'd have a lot of trouble with that. And then if it's not the case that the epistemic anti-realist is true, then the epistemic existence premise is false. So it's clear how you'd be able to get to these two conclusions. So the epistemic anti-realist, it's not the case that the epistemic anti-realist is true, and so the epistemic existence premise is false once you've added these two premises in here. But I would just get off the train right here. I am not convinced that this is true, so I need you to show me those categorical epistemic reasons to believe the epistemic anti-realist. There's why I don't think Rem's arguments are persuasive. I basically just need to be shown that categorical norms exist, right? Like, currently I'm only aware of hypothetical norms, and I've never seen a persuasive case for categorical norms. And both of these arguments rely at some point on an assertion that categorical norms exist. So right here, first argument, but there are categorical epistemic reasons for belief. And then the second one, once you actually fix it, because I don't mind the first part. I'm fine with you just reaching that disjunct, whatever, that's okay. But to get to the other premises, or the other conclusions, you have to add in some premises and like the kind of things you'd need to add, like I'm just going to have trouble signing off on, like this premise right here. So that's my response to Rem. I didn't find the video persuasive. He debated me at one point, but he actually fled. Like, I mean, maybe that's funny wording, too, so I'm not trying to be a dick. But I'm happy to debate him again if he thinks that he can, better defend this position. The offer's open. Okay, that's all for today. Till next time.